Well, welcome everybody to our virtual talk tonight. I'm really pleased that you've chosen to spend your time with us this evening to learn more about the log cabin from Canatara Park. My name is Dana Thorne and I'm the Curator Supervisor at Lambton Heritage Museum. I'll be the moderator for the presentation tonight, and I'll also be presenting on the history of the cabin with my two panelists, Sandi Spalding and Roger Hay. One of the things that's become mainstream over the past year of the pandemic is interacting over Zoom. If you haven't had the chance to participate in a Zoom presentation before, there's a few things you should keep in mind. You can use the chat box to talk with other attendees or to make comments. To get the chat started, you can share where you're watching from tonight. One of the small blessings of this virtual platform is that we can welcome people from anywhere in the world, as opposed to just people who are able to drive to the museum. But of course, we do miss hosting in-person events at the museum, and we're looking forward to when we can reopen later this spring. So while we're spending this virtual evening together, share where you're from in the chat. Make sure that you have all attendees selected before you send your messages, or only me and the panelists will see what you're trying to say. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A section or the chat to submit your questions. And I'll keep track of those questions as we go, and I'll present them to our panel after we're done speaking. Also, I will be posting the video from our talk tonight to the Lambton Heritage Museum YouTube channel. So it'll be available if you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with family or friends. We'll also send out an e-blast to everyone who had registered with the link to the talk once that's available. I'll open with a bit of information about Lambton Heritage Museum. We are a community museum that preserves the history of Lambton County. The museum is located about 8 kilometers south of Grand Bend along Highway 21, directly across the highway from Pinery Provincial Park. Owned and operated by the County of Lambton, we have a main exhibition building and a 30-acre lot that contains a variety of historic buildings. These buildings have been brought to the museum from other locations in Lambton County. We've traditionally had 5 historic buildings on our site, including Rokeby School from Brook Alvinston. You can see it in the top left corner. It was built in 1899 and moved to the museum in 1990. We also have the Cameron Church, which came to us from Don Euphemia. It was built in 1867 and moved to the museum in 2000. And another example is the Williamson Blacksmith Shop, which came from Lambton Shores. It was built in the late 1800s and moved to the museum in 1978. The county has a tradition of recognizing extraordinary historic buildings that are at risk and bringing them to our museum, where they can be interpreted and toured by future generations of visitors. The Canatara Cabin is our first historic building from Sarnia and our first log structure. It will also be the oldest historic building at Lambton Heritage Museum, with an estimated construction date of about 1830. The museum was pleased to offer an alternative space for this great piece of history when it needed to find a new home outside Canatera Park. And the log cabin actually has a fascinating history of moving around. In tonight's virtual talk, we're going to explore the 3 big moves that have been made by this log cabin. I'm going to begin by looking at the cabin's earliest roots in Huron County. Sandi Spalding will take over the discussion, look at the cabin after if it was moved to Lakeshore Road in Sarnia, and Roger Hay will share his memories of the cabin at Lakeshore Road and its move to Canatera Park in 1971. The cabin was originally built in Huron County in the 1830s. It's been challenging to track down exactly where it was built and who owned the cabin when it was in Huron County. The log cabin spent 100 years there before it was moved to Lakeshore Road in the 1930s. It was purchased by the Spaulding family. Margaret Spalding was the daughter of Maud Hannah, one of Sarnia's best-known philanthropists. Maud Hannah was instrumental in the formation of Canatera Park, matching the city of Sarnia dollar for the purchase of the land that became the park back in 1932. Sandi will be sharing more about that period of the cabin's history during her part of the presentation later tonight. After being owned by the Spaulding family for 4 decades, the cabin was purchased by William Lorne Hay. He ultimately donated the building to the city of Sarnia, and it was moved to Canatera Park in May 1971, where it spent almost 5 decades before coming to Lambton Heritage Museum at the end of 2020. On this slide, you can see a picture from November 2020 of an outdoor art class that was painting the cabin. This picture was captured less than a month before the cabin was moved to the museum. But back to Huron County in the 1830s. Where was the cabin built? Who owned it before it was purchased by the Spauldings and moved to Lakeshore Road? I've done a deep dive into the historical records trying to answer these questions, and I found some potential candidates, but my research is continuing and I don't have a definitive answer yet. However, there are some intriguing possibilities, and I'm really excited to share those with you here tonight. On this slide, you can see an early picture of the cabin, as well as an excerpt from the City of Sarnia's bylaw from February 1989 that designated the log cabin as having historic or architectural value or interest. This bylaw provided designation for the cabin, as well as the carriage shed and smokehouse that had been constructed after 1930. The bylaw included a description of the buildings with a small nugget about the cabin's origins in Huron County. I've included that text here on this slide. It indicated that Margaret Spalding bought the cabin from the Geddes family dry goods store. The log cabin was taken apart and floated down Lake Huron on a log boom to Lakeshore Road. Here it was reassembled. This description of the cabin was pulled from an article written by Eric Porsk of the Sarnia Historical Society for their newsletter in November 1980. Attempts to gather additional information about this early history from families that lived in the cabin or the city of Sarnia haven't been successful so far. So what we have is a name, the Geddes family, a business, the dry goods store, and a time frame, 1830s, and a very large Huron County to try to narrow down this mystery. One of the early leads I followed up on came from the 1879 Illustrated Historical Atlas of the County of Huron. These volumes were produced for counties across Ontario and contain detailed maps breaking down the lots and concessions of townships, including the names of property owners. They're a really great resource for researchers, and they're very interesting. They've been digitized and can be searched online. I'll share the link to the online database when I'm done speaking so that you can check it out if you're very keen and you'd like to see some of these historical atlases for yourself. In Morris Township in Huron County, 3 lots were owned by the Geddes family: David Geddes, John Geddes, and William Geddes. Most intriguingly, the lot to the left of David Geddes was owned by a William Hanna. One's imagination starts to whirl with the possibilities. Perhaps this is where the Hanna family met the Geddes family and identified the old log cabin on their property and arranged to purchase it and move it to Lakeshore Road. Adding to the appeal of these 3 Geddes lots is that they're located right beside the Maitland River, which winds through Huron County before emptying into Lake Huron at Goderich. How easy it might have been to disassemble the cabin, load it onto the log boom mentioned in the bylaw description, and then float the logs all the way to their new home in Sarnia. This location seemed like a slam dunk and a perfect fit, but it was too early to break out any celebratory champagne. Geddes is actually a pretty common surname in Huron County. In the fall of 1852, these 3 Geddes brothers arrived in Morris Township from Scotland and settled on adjacent lots. They were among the earliest settlers in Huron County. Lots were divided into 20-acre portions, and the Geddes brothers each settled on either the northern or southern 100 acres of these lots. In the case of David and John, they split the southern half of Lot 8, Concession 3 down the middle. Using provincial land records, I established that while there were originally 3 Geddes brothers that settled in Morris Township, only one of these brothers passed along land to his son that was still being farmed by the family when Margaret Spalding purchased the log cabin in about 1930. John Geddes sold his lot in 1897, and William Geddes sold his lots in 1916. David Geddes sold half of his holdings outside the family, but his son Robert acquired 50 acres of this property in 1892 and farmed it for the next 40 years. You can see that portion in gray on this slide. It's tantalizingly close to the river, making it perfect for transporting the cabin. Perhaps the neighboring Hanna family bought the cabin from Robert Geddes here in the early 1930s. Unfortunately, I was never able to connect these neighboring Hannas with Maud Hanna and her husband William, whose daughter Margaret bought the Canatera cabin. I worked through provincial registration records of marriages, births, and deaths. One of the marriage records can be seen here, as well as the annual census records to try to make a familial connection. In the census I included on this slide, you can see William Hanna and his family listed at the top, and then their neighbors, David Geddes with his wife Isabel and their son David at the bottom of the census form. But this William Hanna and his wife Jane passed their property along to a son George, who moved to Manitoba in 1909 and wrapped up that Hanna family story in Huron County. Through my genealogical research, I couldn't actually connect these Huron County Hannas with the Hannas of Sarnia. Plus, it didn't sit well with me that the Geddes brothers in Huron County lacked the business connection from the City of Sarnia bylaw description. The cabin history had stated Geddes family dry goods store, and the Robert Geddes I found as the property owners in the 1930s was a farmer. He had a nephew that owned a hardware store, but this didn't seem like a great fit. So with my champagne still firmly corked, I started working on another lead. The dry goods store reference turned out to be significant. An entirely different set of Geddes brothers, William and James, opened a dry goods store in Strathroy on March 12, 1881. Tomorrow that will have been exactly 140 years ago. The picture on this slide shows the store in Strathroy. They were so successful with the Strathroy store that James opened a second store in Sarnia under the name Geddes Brothers in 1895. In the 1911 Sarnia and Point Edward directory, James is listed as the owner of the Geddes Brothers Dry Goods Millinery, and his son Gordon is listed as the assistant manager. By the 1925 city directory, Gordon Geddes had taken over as owner, and the description in that directory provides a bit more detail about the goods they had for sale. It says dry goods, ladies, ready-to-wear, millinery, rugs, house furnishings, 170 Front Street North and 167 North Christina. This dry goods store seems like an exact fit for the reference in the Sarnia City bylaw. Gordon Geddes ended up dying relatively young at the age of 41. He was sick for less than a week with influenza before dying on November 16, 1926. After Gordon's untimely death, the dry goods store was managed by his wife Lorena until her decision to sell the store to Walker Stores Limited in November 1930. The Sarnia Canadian Observer provided the following description in an article on November 25, 1930, entitled "Geddes Store is Purchased by a Toronto Firm." Mrs. Geddes said she was glad to be relieved of the very heavy responsibility and was delighted to be able to turn over her business to a firm so well and favorably known throughout Canada, who would maintain the same high standards for which Geddes Brothers has been known in the past. Geddes Brothers were first known in Strathroy, coming to Sarnia 35 years ago, where they opened the departmental store, favorably known as a very high-class store in a very fine building, exceptional quality merchandise, and unusually courteous service. James Ross Geddes established the Sarnia business to be succeeded by Gordon G. Geddes, who carried on until his death 4 years ago, until the business was taken over by Mrs. Gordon Geddes and operated by her until the present sale to the Walker stores. Is it possible that Lorena Geddes owned the cabin in Huron County and arranged for its sale to Margaret Spalding the same year she was selling the Geddes dry goods store? It's very possible. Have I been able to find a record of that sale or prove the connection between this Geddes dry goods store and the cabin in Huron County? Not yet, but I haven't given up. I thought I was very clever in consulting Gordon Geddes' will from 1926, but while it mentioned a lot of real estate holdings in Sarnia, it had no mention of Gordon Geddes owning any property in Huron County. I don't think this means that it wasn't their cabin, but it means that the search for a document that can prove this connection remains elusive. So the research continues. I just got a good lead in the last few weeks that might take us in a new direction. An architectural firm from Goderich was hired in about 1999 when the city of Sarnia arranged for restoration work to be done to the cabin. We got copies of these architectural drawings from the city, and the architect who did the drawings is still in business. He may have more information about the origins of the cabin in his files. His recollection was that the cabin was built in Lucknow and then loaded onto the log boom in Amberley before being shipped to Lambton County. I'll be consulting with him further about this information and probably arranging another visit to the Huron County Archives in Goderich to follow up on any details he can provide. So there may be a popping bottle of champagne in my future, and the hunt through the history records continues. While we're still working to establish exactly where in Huron County this log cabin was built, what we do know is that it was purchased by Margaret Spalding in about 1930. You can see the cabin at the Lakeshore Road location in this picture. Sandi Spaulding, Margaret's granddaughter, is going to share about this next chapter in the cabin's history. Sandi is a fifth-generation Sarnian and a retired researcher and university professor. She has an undergraduate degree in occupational therapy from Western University and master's and doctoral degrees in biomechanics from the University of Waterloo. Her career included working as a professor at Purdue University and the University of Wisconsin. Her last academic position was as a full-time professor at Western University, where she researched and taught in rehabilitation and health sciences. She retired to Sarnia and now lives in her family home that is beside the land that the Canatera Cabin stood on from the 1930s to the 1970s. Sandi is going to share about the cabin after it arrived on Lakeshore Road in Sarnia, where it was owned by her Spaulding family. Please go ahead and take it away, Sandi.
Thank you very much, Dana. You have gone much farther along that road for history than the last time I talked to you. That's pretty exciting. Great.
Hopefully we find an answer soon.
Good luck with it. That's fantastic. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the cabin when it was next door to where I live now, and some of the family members who were there. And I'm excited because some of them are here this evening. I haven't checked to see who made it, but I saw Betsy from Vancouver, and she'll turn up in one of these pictures, and my sister as well, I think, is here. So that's pretty exciting. Okay, as a fifth generation Sarnian and the great granddaughter of Jack and Maud Hanna, who were both active in their hometown and contributed to it, I'm really happy to provide a bit of the history of the Canatera Cabin when it was situated on Lakeshore Road after the 1930s that Dana's talked about, and before the 1970s that Roger will talk about. After the Canatera Cabin was floated down the lake to Sarnia in the 1930s, it was reassembled on the land owned on Lakeshore Road by Maud Hanna, my great-grandmother, and by my grandmother, Margaret Spalding, next to the land I now own, where I've retired recently. One of my first memories as a young child is related to this particular picture. I remember standing, peeking around the corner of the cabin on the right side of this image beside a beautiful lilac tree first thing in the morning. The rule was that my sister Trish and I couldn't go and play with my cousins, whom we called the cottage kids, until after they'd finished breakfast. So they were still eating in the screened-in porch. We had to go home and wait longer. Some of my very best childhood memories are running through the cabin with many Spaulding cousins who were there for the summer. When the weather was nice, we didn't stay long in the cabin, and I don't think we have any pictures of the inside of it at all, but we headed right down to the beach. When it was raining, we sat in front of the fireplace and played crokinole and drank hot chocolate. Next picture. This is a picture of Maud Hanna. Of all the people linked to Canatera Cabin, the one who's probably best known by people here in Sarnia and who contributed most to the Lambton County is Maud Hanna. Through her donation to the city, Maud helped create Canatera Park, as Dana's already mentioned. It's interesting that the log cabin that belonged to her daughter, then her grandson, eventually found its way back to Canatera. I thought that was an interesting connection there. Next. Margaret Spalding, Maud Hanna's daughter, and my grandmother owned the cabin from the early 1930s until her death in 1957. She's pictured here with her daughter, Betsy, and Betsy's son, my cousin Patrick, on the right, and Tom and Alice Spalding with my cousin Betsy on Alice's lap on the left-hand side. And Betsy's here this evening. I don't know whether she recognizes herself in this picture. Margaret was an interesting person in her own right. She graduated with a master's degree from the University of Toronto at a time when few women went to graduate school. And then she spent her summers here with as many family members around her as she could get. And there were a bunch of us, so it was great. Next, please. She was also a bit scandalous because of her involvement with the Communist Party and her position as the president of the Canadian Civil Rights Union, as was described in an article by Ross Lambertson in the Beaver magazine. In the image on this page, she's on the left and William Patterson is on the right. He was an American who was apparently to give a talk in Toronto, but the Canadian Immigration Authority would not let him speak. So he was up on the stage with a gag on. It sort of looked like a pandemic mask to me at this point, but that's probably our perspective now. And Margaret read the speech instead. So she was a bit forward thinking and forward acting too. However, her actions were a problem for the family. One of my aunts, Alice, who was an accomplished artist, and my father working here in Sarnia as a mechanical engineer at Dow Chemical, were both worried about losing their jobs because of Margaret's activisms with the socialists. And I think, we can check with Betsy or Neil, but I think Alice actually did lose a job because of Margaret's activities. This aspect of Margaret's life was one that was not frequently discussed in the family. On reflection, her actions might have been related to having lost a brother, Neil Hanna, in the First World War. Also, through her involvement in socialist issues, she was probably just following the teachings of her father, Jack Hanna, who believed in contributing to the common good. He was responsible for the Hanna Act that resulted in the first government subsidized housing in Ontario, and also spearheaded prison reforms in Canada in the early 1900s. And for the people in the Sarnia area who are listening to this talk and who like golf, he was one of the founding members of the Sarnia Golf and Curling Club. So he wasn't all business. The next person in the family, next picture, that I'd like to mention is Roberta Mcadams. Roberta Mcadams was my great aunt, and she may have been hosted at the cabin, although we don't have any records of that. She did move to Alberta. She certainly would have been in touch with her sister Maud and her niece Margaret. Roberta was born and raised in Sarnia. As noted in this excerpt from the National Library of Canada and the National Archives of Canada, Roberta was one of the first two women elected to a legislature in Canada and in the British Empire. The first and only woman representative to be elected by the armed services in the British Empire, and the very first woman to introduce a piece of legislation in the British Empire. A book by Debbie Marshall entitled Give Your Other Vote to the Sister tells of the fascinating story of Roberta Mcadams, starting with her childhood here in Sarnia and Lambton County. Next. Dr. Bill Spaulding, the oldest son of Margaret, also stayed at the cabin as a boy and brought his wife, Mary, and 4 children, Brenda, Julia, Dick, and Andrew, there in the summers. And so I got to spend lots of time with all of them. Bill was one of the founding members of the Stellar McMaster Medical Program. Problem-based learning, a teaching technique developed by Bill, has been adopted by medical schools internationally, including Harvard Medical School. He was also a good teacher here in Sarnia. I remember being on the beach with him and my cousins. Bill would take a hammer down and would break open some of the rocks so we could see the insides of them. I have absolutely no memory of any of us worrying about eye protection at that point, but it was good fun when we were kids. One aspect of the timing of this cabin restoration that is poignant and very sad to me is that Bill's younger son, my cousin Andrew, passed away suddenly last summer. Andrew was the maverick, and I think probably the most interesting cousin in my generation. He left southwestern Ontario and became a trapper and was seriously off the grid outside Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories for some of his life. More importantly for this project and the rebuilding of the cabin, he made and repaired log cabins in Yellowknife, not unlike the Canatara Cabin. I think Andrew would have really enjoyed this project and probably would have been interested in following its restoration. Next. Of all the visitors who came to spend time with the family in the summer, probably the most notable would be Sir Frederick Banting. Sir Frederick Banting was a Nobel laureate and he discovered insulin. Dr. Banting was also an accomplished amateur artist. Family legend told to me by my father, Jack Spaulding, has it that Dr. Banting doodled on the walls of the outhouse during visits to the cabin. Unfortunately, neither the outhouse nor the cabin pictures survived. I was talking to my cousin Neil the other day and I said, are we pretty sure that this is true? And he said, oh, probably, because his father, Neil's father, Tom, and Frederick Banting's son ran away from home together at the age of 12. And I think they were gone for all of 3 hours. So that's another family legend to go along with it. Okay, next picture. This image was taken on the beach with the cabin in the background before all the erosion caused havoc with it. This is taken in the early 1950s. Although there's no date on the picture, I know when it was taken because I'm the one with the binoculars standing in the front. The person standing is my uncle, Tom Spaulding, and the people sitting with him are Herb and Florence, friends of Tom, and behind me is Tom's wife, Alice. All were very active in the arts community in Toronto. Tom bought the cabin from his mother's estate. A sense of the meaning of the cabin to him was well stated in a letter he wrote from England to his siblings, Betsy, Bill, and Jack, dated June 22nd, 1960. He wrote, "First of all, I'd like to clarify exactly what I would like to do about the cottage. I definitely do want to buy it. You have posted all out the probable problems that such a purchase will no doubt produce." And I expect my father had something to do with all the suggestions of the probable problems. But anyway, he didn't say that. But the fact remains, says Tom, I do want it. Although motivated by a strong dose of sentimentalism, this is a very practical proposition. It is our intention, for example, to return to Canada and mostly to Sarnia for as much as possible next summer. As a child in the 1930s, Tom built sailing dinghies at the cabin. Tom had a distinguished career, including working as the art director for CBC in Toronto when it started in 1952, and was the design director of the Canadian Confederation train in 1967. His later political interest focused on Indigenous peoples' issues as a writer for the Métis Voyageur. Of course, there are many more stories about the people who have owned or visited the cabin over 200 years. Some of the cousins whom I've mentioned are listening in this evening, and I know they have many good memories of the cabin. When we first started working to save the cabin, I was a bit surprised to find out there was no documented history associated with it when it stood in Canatera. Since my interactions with the members of the Heritage Museum group, I'm no longer worried about the stories being lost. Dana has been actively collecting archival information about the cabin, as is obvious from her speech earlier, and she and I have been working collaboratively in collecting my family's stories. The Heritage Museum will be a good steward of both the building and histories from all of us. The Canatara Cabin and the stories will be well preserved. Next picture. I have to admit a feeling of trepidation when I watched the log cabin being dismantled by cranes in December, log by log. But then I thought, the builders of the cabin in the 1830s did not have cranes. The workers who floated it down the lake in the 1930s did not have cranes. They were able to build and rebuild it. Of course, it can be restored with 21st century equipment and knowledge. Exactly 1 year ago today, the World Health Organization declared a pandemic and gave the disease a name, COVID-19. We've all been affected by the pandemic. Next picture. My particular story is that my daughter Carly and my son-in-law Jeff had my very first grandchild 1 month ago today. Because of the pandemic, I have to wait patiently to meet him because they live just outside Washington, D.C. My baby grandson, Jack, is named after both my dad, Jack Spaulding, and our great-grandfather, Jack Hanna, husband of Maud Hanna. It will be wonderful when my new grandson can come to visit. When Jack's a little older and the cabin's restored, I can take him to the cabin that belonged to his great-great-great-grandmother 100 years ago and tell him the stories of my childhood in it. And much more importantly, I can use the log cabin as a backdrop to give him a glimpse into his Canadian history. Next picture. What a tribute to our heritage and to conservation, which is really important today, is not tearing things down, but conserving them. Putting the Canatera Cabin back together again, so it can stand as a legacy from us to future generations of Canadians. Like me, with my grandson, Jack, many other members of my family and many people in Sarnia and Lambton can tell stories about the Canatera Cabin and the place of log cabins like it in our Canadian story, even before Canada was a country. The Canatera Cabin made it through one pandemic 100 years ago, and now, once funding is completed, it will be restored and make it through this one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's great to hear those personal stories and better understand the families that lived in the cabin. So thank you very much. Our next speaker tonight is Roger Hay. Roger is a Sarnia native and a retired elementary school teacher. His father, William Lorne Hay, purchased the Canatara Cabin from the Spaulding family. Roger will share with us the Hay family's experience with the cabin and the cabin's transition to Canatera Park in 1971.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, everyone, for attending this. The slide that you're seeing here is not one that I'm familiar with, in that because when I was about 14, back about 1968, back in the last millennium, wow. Anyway, the erosion was back further. The buildings that were connected to the main cabin, which is on the right, had already been taken down, and the cliff was actually right to the foundation wall of the cabin. And I can remember, even at that age, standing on the edge of that cliff, the log cabin wall right next to me, looking down, looking at it and thinking, this is not a good thing. My family, my father bought this property back in 1968, and his intention, my sister tells me, was to build a family home or maybe a family compound there. If you could, next slide, please. This picture is in the backdrop on the right-hand side. You will see a guest house or the smokehouse, and to the left of it, behind the gentleman who is Bob Harrison, you will see the carriage house. Now, this picture was taken in 1971, the spring thereof, and the cabin facilities were going to be moved to Canatera Park. Bob Harrison was the director of the Sarnia Parks and Recreation Department, and he became the founding director of the St. Clair Parkway Commission. Next, please. This is a picture of my mother, Frances, in the upstairs, one of the upstairs bedrooms, and this was a custom-made teak cabinet that was obviously there. Next, please. This is my father's obituary. It's just indicating that he was a businessman and an alderman. He died in February 1970, rather suddenly. And it was at that time that we found out that he and his good friend, Bob Harrison, had been discussing donating the cabin and the other buildings to the city of Sarnia. And implicit in that, I was told, was that the city would maintain the property for the use and enjoyment of all the citizens of Sarnia in perpetuity. Next, please. This is a picture coming from May 1971 of the cabin's trip from 1572 Lakeshore Road to Canatera Park. Abrams did the moving, and the move was paid for by a service club that my father was a member of, and that is the Seaway Kiwanis. You will notice that the guest house, or the smokehouse I pointed out to you, it was transported as well. It has since fell into disrepair and has been demolished. And the carriage house was also transported, and it too fell into disrepair and has since been replaced. The log cabin is something that has been in my family since I was a kid. It's always been part of our family discussions, and it was wonderful taking our kids and relatives down there. And as a family, we really enjoyed the fact that it was so well appreciated by the city of Sarnia. The Save the Log Cabin Committee, consisting of Paul Badette, Sandi Spalding, Toby Bidness, Alexa Copeland, and myself, we came together because we were concerned about City Hall's intention to demolish the cabin, as they felt it had deteriorated beyond repair. We as a group made a verbal presentation to City Council, and our members of the committee made 2 presentations to the Heritage Committee for support in restoring this cabin. Sadly, we did not get that support, and City Council voted 5-4 to demolish it. This was a very sad hour for us, and we had long faces, and we were wondering just what the heck was going to happen. And then, thank goodness, out of the blue, so to speak, we were contacted by the County of Lambton, and they were expressing an interest in the log cabin. It's wonderful. We met with Andrew Mayer, who is the Director of Cultural Services Department, Lori Webb, who's the Manager of Museum and Archives, and Dana here, who is the Curator of the Lambton Heritage Museum. I tell you, we were so impressed with their interest in acquiring the cabin. They treated us so well. They were so enthusiastic. It just became clear so very quickly that the Heritage Museum property was an appropriate new home for our log cabin. We felt fully reassured that it would be properly maintained, appreciated, and respected, and held in trust for future generations to enjoy. And I tell you, when that cabin moved to the new property, and having talked to these people, I am very, very optimistic about the future of our cabin. Thank you.
Could I unmute myself here? Excellent. Thank you so much, Roger, for sharing. Indeed, the log cabin was well loved in Canatera Park for almost 50 years. It was a key focal point in the animal farm and an important space for programming. Multiple generations of Sarnians have very fond memories of making Christmas cookies in this cozy cabin. We found a few pictures from the Sarnia Historical Society collection that highlighted Christmas programming in the cabin. You can see a few of those on the slide here. However, the Canatara Cabin had been closed to the public for a considerable period in the last decade. So as Roger outlined, when the decision was made to replace the old cabin with the new one in Canatera Park for on-site programming, Lambton Heritage Museum saw an opportunity to provide a new home to the original cabin. Since we have a longstanding tradition of welcoming historic buildings to our museum site, the museum was a natural fit. Additionally, it will be our first log structure at the museum and now the oldest historic building in our holdings as well. So after we connected with the Save the Canatera Cabin fundraising committee, the plan was hatched to move the cabin to Lambton Heritage Museum. The city of Sarnia engaged a local business to prepare the cabin to be moved. Originally, we hoped to keep the cabin mostly intact during the move, just taking off the roof, but keeping the rest of the cabin together during the transportation process. However, as the project progressed, it became apparent that the cabin could not be moved safely without risk of the structure deteriorating during the trip to Lambton Heritage Museum. So partway through the preparations, the decision had to be made to disassemble the logs and move them to Lambton Heritage Museum in pieces. It's a bit poetic that the cabin made its final move by the logs being taken apart, since that's how the cabin was moved from Huron County to Lakeshore Road. To ensure that the cabin can be put back together in its new location, every log was tagged with a unique number corresponding to architectural sketches. This will allow the restoration specialists to put the building back together. There were also extensive series of photographs taken of the exterior and the interior of the building. This careful documentation will be crucial for the success of any future restoration work. It was cold, a bit snowy, and just before Christmas when all the components were loaded onto a truck and the cabin started its trip to Lambton Heritage Museum. Here you can see the roof of the cabin making a dramatic trip up Highway 21. It's interesting that as the cabin comes to Lambton Heritage Museum, just south of Grand Bend, it's actually much closer to its original roots in Huron County than it was when it was located in Sarnia. And here are a few additional highway shots. If you want to see more pictures of the cabin move, including video footage of the dismantling in Canatera Park, you can visit the cabin webpage on our museum website. I'll share this link in the chat in a few minutes, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested in seeing more pictures of the move. We breathed a collective sigh of relief when the roof was safely delivered to Lambton Heritage Museum, although maneuvering the truck with the roof to its final resting place involved dancing around some of the beautiful oak trees that are on our museum grounds. You can see in the top right corner that one of the trees had to be winched and pulled several inches out of the way to make enough clearance for the truck. This was certainly a dramatic and nail-biting moment in the cabin move. Here I have a video. I'm just going to show part of it, showing the triumphant arrival at Lambton Heritage Museum. And if you want to see more of that footage, you can check out a slideshow that we put together. Sorry, I need to get out of this. Oh. Sorry, just trying to get out of my video here. Okay. Oh no. Sorry, just give me a sec. I shouldn't have gone with the video. Thank you for your patience. Just a moment and I will be right back. Oh, and look at that. I only had one slide left. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Here I am. For my final slide. Now that the cabin has been moved to Lambton Heritage Museum, we need to complete our fundraising campaign to help pay for the restoration. We've raised almost $16,000 of our $100,000 goal for this project. The fundraising effort is being spearheaded by the grassroots Save the Canatara Cabin group, and both Sandi and Roger are members of that group. So even though the cabin has come to Lambton Heritage Museum, we do require this money to be able to put the cabin back together. If you donate to support the project, the museum's offering a series of incentives, including tax receipts, a greeting card, a free museum membership, and a cabin coaster package, depending on the value of your gift. You can donate online through our website at lambtonmuseums.ca/Canatara Cabin with any credit card. We also have members of the public offer to donate their time as volunteers during the restoration process. It's amazing how many people in our community have specialized skills and trades and a willingness to help. While a professional heritage restoration company will be overseeing the major aspects of the project, there would be opportunities for interested volunteers. You can certainly reach out to the museum by email if you want more information or if you're interested in helping out. I'm just going to open up the museum website here so you can see where you would go if you would like to make a donation. So here is the donation page, and also this is the page where you can find the link to the slideshow with more pictures of the move, information about the different donor levels, the list of our Canatera Cabin supporters. We're really grateful for all of the people who have supported the project so far, as well as some history of the log cabin that's been gathered.
Dana, did you want me to mention the donation that we've just heard about as well?
Yes, please.
Okay, we just recently have heard that a member of the Sarnia community who is an anonymous donor is offering to match $3,000 worth of donations to the cabin. So if we can get $3,000 worth of donations in about the next month, that individual will match those funds, which is very good. So just wanted to add that as well.
That's wonderful news. Thank you, Sandy. And Roger, could you talk a bit more about the work that the committee's done for fundraising so far?
Yes, the Heritage Museum printed up handbills for us, Save the Log Cabin, and I know that Sandy and myself and Alexa have spent some time at the log cabin prior to the demolition, or prior to the take apart, that we handed out these handbills to people who were walking by. I know many were regulars within the park, and also put them on windshields and so on and so forth. We also sent out approximately 700 emails to many Lambton County businesses and the service clubs in the hopes that we would get their support as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in to listen to our presentations today. If anyone has any questions for any of the panelists, we would be happy to take questions now. So you can submit those through the chat or using the Q&A as well. And it's been nice to see some of the memories of the cabin in the chat. From Emily, we heard have wonderful memories of Canatera and its cabin, have walked and wandered and visited during Christmas on the farm every year. It was such an inspiration growing up that my husband and I moved an old log cabin from Oakdale Line to our farm on Mandamin. Very sad it had to leave Canatera, but also celebrate that it will continue to inspire wonder. And we heard from Neil Spaulding. These are wonderful photos. I'm so glad that the cabin is receiving tender, loving care. I have many fond memories of our cottage. When I was very small, I thought it was marvelous to have our very own pioneer cabin. Now I'm glad that everyone can share in it. Thank you, Neil. Thanks for being here. And there was also a comment, the garden on College Avenue is beautifully maintained. What a tribute. There was a beautiful rose garden at the cabin. So. Yeah, so if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them now. Oh, Mayor Bill Weaver said, as Mayor of Lambton Shores and past Warden of Lambton, he's very pleased to have this taking place in our community. Thanks for being with us tonight, Bill. And Betsy Spalding says she's very grateful to the Save the Cabin Committee and to the Lambton Museum for taking on their beloved cottage and cabin. Oh, and we did have a question here from Gary. How much of the money will be needed for restoration or repair versus reassembly? So I see the two items as being intimately connected. So as the cabin is put back together, there may be repairs that need to be done to some of the logs, or some items may need to be replaced throughout that process. So I think that the restoration and reassembly are interconnected projects. Thank you. Oh, something in the Q&A. And a question, you may have already mentioned this, but when do you expect the cabin to be fully restored? That is a great question. And it will depend on the success of the fundraising campaign. So we can't move forward with the restoration project until we've raised the funds to be able to pay for the cabin restoration. So once we have a successful fundraising campaign, we look forward to being able to move forward. It'll certainly be a priority for us at the Heritage Museum to get the cabin up and get it interpreted and back in a state where it can be enjoyed by our visitors. Well, thanks everyone for being with us tonight. I don't know if there's going to be any more questions. Roger or Sandy, was there anything else you wanted to share?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dana. I don't have anything else right now, but thank you for the opportunity to speak about it.
Absolutely, and thank you so much to everyone who chose to spend their evening with us tonight, learning about this wonderful cabin. And the museum looks forward to sharing updates about the progress of the project as we continue. So, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for our virtual talk. Lambton Heritage Museum is hosting another virtual talk next week. Just going to put in a shameless plug. We're hosting Amanda Bitchell from Birds Canada, and she is going to speak about bird migrations. As you all may be aware, the tundra swan migration is happening right now in Lambton Shores. So today we had thousands of tundra swans in the fields behind Lambton Heritage Museum. So even though the museum's closed, you can still come out and see the swans. It's a great socially distant activity, and it's been wonderful with this warm weather. And we'll be hosting a virtual talk like this one with Amanda Bitchell, who's going to talk about the tundra swans as well as other bird migration in the area. So that's next Thursday, March 18th, same time, starting at 7 o'clock. So you can sign up for that on our website. So maybe I'll see you again next week. And thank you so much, everyone, for all your kind comments and for being with us tonight. And I'm going to sign off and keep an eye out for the e-blast with the link to the recorded presentation if you want to watch again or if you want to share it with anybody. All right, have a great night.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Thanks.